collective choices and actions and the future we want to shape and for generations to come. At the New School, we have a long-standing tradition of exchanging bold ideas and voices. Our students, faculty, and community are dedicated to challenging boundaries and creating new innovative paths forward. Tonight upholds that tradition by gathering speakers whose work spans policy, labor, and activism, fostering a space where knowledge can inspire action. I encourage you to use this evening not only to hear from our panelists, but also to reflect and carry these insights into your own activism, work, and communities. Climate change is a defining issue of our time, but it also presents an opportunity to build a just, equitable, and more resilient world. So thank you for being here and part of a community that believes change is both possible and necessary. I would also like to thank the people at the New School and the New Republic for making this event happen. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's program, which begins with a few words from Robert Musil, President and CEO of the Rachel Carson Council. Thank you.
It is great to be here at the New School. I have to tell you, the program that we are involved in is talking about shaping our future, and in New York City. I've just escaped from Washington, D.C. and its occupation to come here to be with all of you so I could be at a place where we could shape the future. And it is absolutely critical to our lives, to our future, to our communities. And that's why I wanted, with the Rachel Carson Council, to sponsor this event, to be part of something here in New York City, where I have to tell you, I was born in Manhattan, and I'll leave out all my New York credentials. I want you to understand that what happens here actually never is just about New York City. I understand we were talking about communities. We have panels with district representatives and professors, but what happens here shapes the entire world. That has always been the case, particularly in terms of environment, climate, justice, environmental health, and concern for communities and the planet. It started, not to run around in too much history, but you would be aware that some of the earliest efforts that that our tradition grows out of include folks like in the New York area, Pete Seeger and the Clearwater Sloop. I'm having a little trouble seeing if there's anyone here old enough to remember Pete Seeger. But we move on from there, and I've worked with many people in New York around environmental health and environmental justice. Thinking about Peggy Shepard and We Act, and how when I was at Physicians for Social Responsibility, another group deeply concerned about climate justice and the environment, that she won a Rachel Carson Prize, that was some of the most important work and a lesson for me and the organizations that I've been involved with of the importance of working closely in and with the community. And then it's the role, it seems to me, for folks like me with a national organization to try to help, assist, connect, bring together, support folks who are actually doing the work and making a difference in our lives, and that's in the community. So you may wonder, how does Rachel Carson fit into all of this? I normally, particularly with college audiences, I know you're not all students, I like to ask those Ferris Bueller questions. Anyone? Bueller, who was Rachel Carson? Yeah, well, okay. I didn't think you knew the answer to that, but I think we should understand that Rachel Carson was not just the lone writer, the famous woman who wrote a book, single book, Silent Spring, and set off the modern environmental movement, which is why we are here for Climate Week, here at the New School with the New Republic, and trying to shape our future. That's what people know, but she was not just concerned about pesticides and DDT. She cared deeply not only about nuclear weapons and nuclear fallout and nuclear testing, but also about an early versions of environmental justice. For those of you who may have read Silent Spring or had it in a course, she actually talks in there not just about birds, robins, and DDT, but about farm workers in California who are the ones who are most exposed. They are the ones who handle, get sprayed, have to make their livings, and have no other choice. At the time she was writing this, there are Mexicans and then Mexican Americans, Chicanos, who had absolutely no political representation, ability to say no about anything, and she found that absolutely outrageous. Same thing with nuclear testing. She wrote so movingly about a woman in the Arctic, an Inuit mother, Eskimos back in the day, and how our open-air nuclear testing sent the rain and fallout down thousands of miles away, where it enters into the water, into the food chain, from the fish, into seals, into blubber, and into a mother nursing her child, where those radionuclides, that radiation goes through the placental barrier while she's breastfeeding and threatens her baby. Talk about unrepresented. This is a woman, of course, thousands of miles away, doesn't even know there's the United States, doesn't know there's radiation or atomic bombs or any of it, and yet subject to this. That is what Carson is deeply outraged about. But she also turned her attention, if you will, to corporate power and greed. We are talking about the economy and how we can shape our future. Carson in Silent Spring, of course, took on the corporations that made the DDT. She just didn't say, oh, stop spraying or don't use it in the backyard, confronted them head on. And so they assaulted her. They gave the usual slurs, threats of lawsuits, paid doctors to follow her around and spread lies about her. Very much what we know a little bit about today. And so I want to also add that because of the coalitions we're building and the people engaged in this program that you're going to hear shortly, that involves labor, people working about, worried about corporate power and so on, and politics. Rachel Carson spoke out against the Eisenhower administration. Some of you may think, oh, wasn't he that nice old guy who had a heart attack and played golf? Well, it turns out that he fired the heads of all the environmental organizations, the one that Carson worked for at the time, and she spoke out about how this is the example of how greed creates monstrous evils, and how this action of firing the heads of environmental organizations will allow unfettered drilling and exploitations of resources and will lead to the destruction of the planet. This is the 50s. We're seeing similar things. And so I wanted to be here and support all of you as you're working and thinking and figuring out how can we build a better future and do community work and organizing and help change the climate. So our organization, the Rachel Carson Council, was actually, when Rachel Carson was writing Silent Spring, she was dying of breast cancer. She knew it was a sad story, and she said, I want you to start an organization that will carry on my work. That is the Rachel Carson Council today. And in carrying on that work, we put together those concerns that I've just rattled off about greed and corporations, about the planet, about environmental health, about environmental justice. And so we build campaigns that involve from the community up all the way to creating large national coalitions that are based in the leadership of community activists. And then we head back to Washington and push on those people who don't want to hear anything about this. And so that's why we're doing a campaign now that you won't have heard of, and I'm not going to do the Ferris Bueller questions, but building out of these concerns, you should know that there are two major corporations in this world, one called Drax, and there's a report out back that I've left some copies of our brand new report, Drax, the Destroyer of Worlds. It's a corporation along with the Enviva Corporation, which is headquartered in Bethesda, Maryland, where I live, with a glittering glass building that says Aviva and Viva on the top. What's going on the ground is they clear cut forests, then grind them up in factories in the United States, and then ship industrial scale amounts of wood pellets by the hundreds of millions of tons overseas to be put into old coal-fired utilities and burned for electricity. And then they get credit for it as being sustainable and renewable because the people who wrote the international rules were affected by the very kind of wealthy corporate interests that we see here. And so I do want to tell you that this particular forum started in North Carolina. It's where the Carson Council encountered it. We were doing work there on environmental justice, but we learned about it from the community folks who lived right next door to these facilities, whose homes were covered in sawdust and noise, who knew they were being polluted, their communities destroyed. They didn't need some big environmentalist from Washington, D.C., or even us to tell them about that. What they wanted was someone to speak up and join them and help support this effort. That's what we did. Even as the wood pellet industry has been spreading like a cancer, metastasizing from North Carolina down the Gulf Coast, out now to the Northwest and the Pacific Northwest, the opposition has been growing just as fast and even faster. I am happy to tell you on this subject that you don't know anything about, where one of the companies in 10 years spewed out enough emissions, the equivalent of 60 or 70 million cars on the road driving 10,000 miles a year. But we now have stopped their expansion. They wanted to have out in the West, in Tuolumne and Lassen counties in California, they were going to cut down those woods. Then they were building facilities in the ports in San Francisco, Stockton, California, and up in the Northwest to ship them overseas. And that whole effort was stopped and led by community members out in California. And I could repeat this story from North Carolina. Anita Cunningham, a woman who runs all of the community organizations focused on these issues. Treva Gear in Able, Georgia, where they've also fought back. Again, these are community women, women of color who have I'll just tell you, they're so powerful and determined and are not going to take this. And so we follow their lead, watch these industries now being held back, starting to lose fights out in California and in Mississippi. And then we bring them all to Washington. And then with the 9 of the most powerful women leading our week-long advocacy, lobbying, demonstrating, going on about this subject of wood pellets, then people sit up and take notice, and we bring together academics, students from our campus network that we have, labor people, excuse me, elected officials. There are a few who actually care about this subject because we and others have worked and pushed with them. That includes Cory Booker, just for an example, or the one representative in North Carolina where this all happened, who will speak up and fight back, is named Valerie Fouché. And of course, she's one of only 2 Democrats left because of redistricting in North Carolina that will speak up and fight back. And so as we come full circle, you all will hear panelists and district representatives and people who work with labor and in academia and will help build a better future. I'm here to connect up because I want to hear from them how we are shaping a future in New York City that then I and my other networks of community members, of organizations, can link us all together and create even more power. And I know that starting right here in New York City, it will make a difference. There isn't anything that doesn't happen in New York City that doesn't ultimately really shape the world. And so I'm glad to be here, glad to be from New York, and very glad I'm going to sit and learn from people who are doing the work, figuring out our future, and you can join with them. And I hope you will also join with the Rachel Carson Council. I meant to mention, as I close, I have an old-fashioned sign-up sheet. For those of you who remember paper and clipboards, we're going to pass it around. Do I have somebody with a clipboard who's going to pass it around? Well, they may. Also, we're out back, because that will get you involved with all of the people I've been talking about in academia and labor in the frontline communities in North Carolina and around the country. And so, thank you. I want to welcome Kate Aronoff, and she's going to do the show. Thank you.
You hear me? Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Bob, for that kind introduction. I am Kate Aronoff. I'm a staff writer at the New Republic. And I have the pleasure of being your moderator for tonight's conversation, looking at how cities, including New York, can navigate and respond to the climate crisis. Before we jump in, I am going to introduce our esteemed panelists from left to right in no order of political affiliation, just by happenstance. We have Batul Hassan, who is the labor director of Climate and Community Institute, a climate and economic justice think tank, and a member of New York City Democratic Socialists of America Steering Committee. And next to her, we have Baptista, Dr. Baptista, who is an associate professor of environmental policy and sustainability management at the New School, as well as the director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center. Anna was appointed to the 4th New York City panel on climate change, where she co-chaired the Equity Working Group and serves on the New York City Environmental Justice Advisory Board. Then we have Councilwoman Sandy Nurse, who represents New York City's 37th Council District, which includes the neighborhoods of Bushwick, Brownsville, Cypress Hills, City Line, and East New York. She currently serves as the chair of the Committee on Criminal Justice and was formerly chair of the Committee on Sanitation and Solid Waste Management. And then we have Dr. Bhawani Venkataraman, who is an associate professor of chemistry at the New School, as well as the New School's vice president of climate and environmental justice. She's the author of Paradox of Water, Science and Policy of Safe Drinking Water, which was published by the University of California Press in 2023. Give us a round of applause for our panelists. I will keep my introductory remarks short so that we can dig in, but I just wanted to briefly say a few words up top to set us up and set up tonight's conversation. So it's no secret, and maybe for those of you in this room who have been to other climate events in the past or are going to other climate events this Climate Week in New York City, to say that climate discussions can focus on things that might seem a little bit abstract, right? So these sort of far off abstract goals like achieving net zero by a certain time. And in the United States especially, a lot of talk about climate change can treat it as something that's far off or is going to happen somewhere else. But over the last few years, especially here in New York City, we have been dealing with the firsthand effects of the climate crisis, and we know that it's here. According to data collected by NOAA, $8 billion of damages from Hurricane Sandy, economic damages from Hurricane Sandy, are attributable to climate-related sea level rise. Over the last few years, we've dealt with flooded subways, wildfire smoke turning the skies orange, deadly heat waves, and rising costs for home insurance that are helping to push up already outrageous rent prices. At the same time, we've seen the fossil fuel systems that have helped drive this crisis worsen its impact, especially for working class New Yorkers who are deciding between turning on the air and paying their rent at the end of the month. So I'm excited to talk about New York City here tonight with everyone here, not just because I live here and care about it, but also because as the prospects for climate action at the federal level look increasingly bleak, we have a real opportunity to pursue some very transformative policies that can both set an example for the rest of the country, but potentially even reframe some of these older narratives about climate action and refocus on how responding to and navigating the climate crisis can make life more affordable and raise standards of living for everyone across the board. So to start off, I wanted to hear from our panelists about what the climate crisis already looks like here in New York City and sort of get a sense at the ground level for how people are experiencing it here. So I wanted to start with Sandy. And I was wondering if you could tell us how climate change is already showing up in District 37 and how that dovetails with the fossil fuel economy itself.
Sure, absolutely. Good evening, everyone. Hope you all are having a good start to Climate Week, and thank you for inviting me to be in this conversation. So I represent the 37th District in the City Council, which is Brownsville, Bushwick, East New York, Cypress Hill City Line, as mentioned. It is predominantly a community of color, mostly Puerto Rican and Dominican. We have the largest concentration of Dominicans in Brooklyn in my district, in Cypress Hills. We also have a growing South Asian and predominantly Bangladeshi community. And then I have parts of East New York and Brownsville as historical Black community. And it is a generally cash poor community, but it is experiencing I would say, the nitty gritty impacts of the cost of the changing climate. So for example, in my district, I have people who work on my team who spend a lot of their time helping people navigate their utilities. A lot of our constituents have just owe so much money from the summer during the program, during the need for air conditioning. We're doing a lot of enrolling them in programs to bring down their their energy bill in the winter months. And so, I mean, this is like impacts that are hitting their wallet. It's whether or not they turn on their AC on a sweltering day. Getting people into cooling centers is a big part of what we do in the summer. Especially, we had this huge heat wave. I'm in a district that is heat vulnerable. And so we spend a lot of time taking care of our elders and our seniors and people who just don't have money to pay their utility bills. Bushwick is also an area where we've had just anytime it rains, it just floods. And it could just, an hour of rain could turn an entire area of Bushwick into a place where cars are floating down the street. Entire inventory in basements is destroyed. So the actual material cost of the crisis, we've been able to get commitments to resolve some of this. We got like a $350 million commitment for a brand new sewer system. You know, the sewers in New York are 100 years old. They no longer can hold the capacity. But this is also in the smack of one of the largest public housing developments, one of the last public housing developments to be made in New York City, which is in Bushwick, which is Hope Gardens, NYCHA development, and that's where all the flooding is happening. And so we had also during, I forget which hurricane now, I guess it's, yes, Ida. I was like Maria, Ida, all of these. Cypress Hills was a neighborhood where one of the individuals lost their life for flash flooding because of the city's restrictions on illegal basements and the work that's needed to get basement apartments legalized and safe so that people don't die when our infrastructure fails in their basement apartments, because that's what they can afford. So it's life and death. It's constant economic toll to our businesses, to our public housing residents who are constantly dealing with mold and mildew, and then of course just the high cost of utilities.
And I promise we'll get to the more hopeful end of the evening at some point. But just to continue on this front and just sort of get a real sense of what this looks like, I wanted to turn to Bhawani and ask, about the sort of enormous complexity of the systems that just keep our city going. So whether it's subways or utilities, there's just a tremendous amount of work that goes into keeping the city running, and climate change stands to put stress on basically all of them. So people in New York City, for instance, might take for granted the fact that we have clean and I would say quite good drinking water here. But that's not the case for much of the world, and even as your own work details, for many people here in the US. How is it that New York City manages to deliver clean water to millions of people every day? And what kinds of challenges does the climate crisis pose to those operations?
Yes, so thank you. And thank you all for being here today. And thanks for the invitation for being on this panel. So as a chemist, I'm actually going to start at the molecular level and just sort of remind us that the molecule water that we all know as H2O is essential for life. We all know that this planet is habitable because the conditions on this planet make liquid water possible. But paradoxically, for the same reason that water is essential for life, is also why it's very susceptible to contaminations, both biologically from pathogens as well as chemicals. And so the question is, from a human public health perspective, it's not just that we need water, we need safe drinking water. And having safe drinking water undergirds the health of the community. And so one of the things I think we sometimes don't recognize is that the delivery of water, safe water from a source to the tap, is actually a very, very complex process because of this inherent ability for water to get contaminated very easily. It doesn't take much, even water after it's been treated, to then get recontaminated. And so it really depends on this invisible infrastructure that often we're not paying attention to because we open up the tap, the water comes out, we drink it, here in New York City at least. And so there's this huge scientific, engineering, political, economic, policy infrastructure that we've sort of established here in the United States for delivering water from source to tap. And so the way New York City handles this, and it is true that New York City does have incredible high quality water, is if you just go back a little bit in history, in the 1800s, as the city was developing, population expansion, the local bodies of water were getting contaminated. Basically, they were being used as dump for waste. And so the city began to look for how to move water that wasn't immediately around urbanized places, to move that water from those regions into the city. So the first stop was the Croton River, and they moved the water down here. But then very soon that also wasn't sufficient to meet the needs for the city. And so then they moved even further away, about 90 miles away, to the Catskill Delaware watershed. And then in all these practices, the city back then being very powerful, it was a very unjust process. They basically took over land, they displaced local communities, they flooded farms, but they basically were trying to create a system of water further away from urbanization that they could move into the city. It also is interesting to recognize that this whole system, they built the aqueduct to move the water from the Catskill Delaware into the city. It all runs on gravity, so it actually, from an energy perspective, is actually a good model. But like I said, it's all based on these very unjust practices. And then in the 1990s, as a result of some changes in the Safe Drinking Water Act, the city finally had a more cooperative model, memorandum of understanding with the local communities to try a more collaborative management process of the water up there. But the thing to sort of recognize is that by creating this essentially a protected watershed up in the Catskill Delaware system, we've created a system where the natural filtration process of the soil allows the water to be of very high quality. And so much so, because of that, the city, we actually get the water from the Catskill Delaware naturally filtered, but we didn't have to build drinking water treatment facilities for that particular water, which supports about 90% of our drinking water needs. So that has saved the city billions of dollars of capital investment and millions of dollars in terms of annual maintenance fees. And just to juxtapose that, we still get water from the Croton Reservoir, but 10% of that. And that is not a protected watershed. And the city had to build a water filtration system there at the cost of about $2.5 billion. And so by sort of using these nature-based approaches, we, as residents of New York City, have this extremely high quality water. And something really, I think we're one of 5 places in the United States where we do not have to have a drinking water treatment facility to treat the water. It is disinfected, so I should be careful. It's, it's safe. And I'm happy to talk more about why I'm saying that. There's data behind to support this as well, not just me saying it. But from a climate change perspective, yes, those are things that we have to begin to pay attention to. As we have more and more extreme torrential downpour of rain, the runoff into these water bodies will impact the quality of the water. There's also projected droughts, more frequent droughts into the future, which will affect water quality. Warmer temperatures can also trigger harmful algal blooms, and so that also can create toxins. And the one thing I think is what's happening across the United States is the price of drinking water is actually rising. And it's something we're not paying attention to, because it's getting more and more costly to maintain the systems, to meet the regulations, and to deliver safe water. So there are many communities that are being actually priced out of the most basic need, which is safe drinking water. And I believe New York City has some economic plans, to help communities that can't afford the water bill. So there are some cities trying to get ahead of that. The NRDC is doing some really important work in sort of bringing that information forward. But these are the kinds of things we need to be paying attention to, because basic utilities are going to get more expensive, right?
And building on that, everyone essentially gets water out of their tap and turns on the lights and uses these functions every day. But that, as you mentioned, is much harder for some people than others, especially in a city as unequal as New York City. So Anna, I wanted to turn to you and ask sort of how this kind of all comes together. Climate change often gets referred to as a threat multiplier, but it is also can be an inequality multiplier. Could you talk about how New Yorkers' experience of the climate crisis maps onto the city's long history of racial and economic inequality, and how can we make sure that efforts to address the climate crisis don't inadvertently deepen those inequalities and instead make New York a fairer, more equal place, even as it becomes hotter and wetter? Small question.
Small question, very easy. Well, I had the pleasure of being on the 4th New York City panel on climate change, where we dealt precisely with these issues on the equity work group. I worked with Sheila Foster, who's up at Columbia now, and they had done great work in the 3rd report, looking at social vulnerability indexes and overlaying those on the climate threats. And just like we would suspect, the communities that have the highest precipitation and flooding threats, the highest heat threats, are also the same communities that are dealing with a lot of inequality, Black and brown communities, low wealth communities, who lack access to basic amenities like green space, affordable healthcare, affordable housing. And so not only is climate change exacerbating those inequalities, but it is, what we are projecting forward in the 4th report, and you can all see it online, is a dire picture actually of threat and inequality multipliers that are, we're talking about, 32 days over 95 degrees by mid-century, a 12% increase in precipitation. We're talking about pluvial flooding like you described, which is flooding just from intense rain, not even from, cresting sea level rise or coastal flooding that we saw in Sandy. So it doesn't take a lot to basically throw communities that are already quite vulnerable into, crisis. And so the data is well known. There's a lot of great data. So what we did in the 4th panel on climate change on the equity work group is it's not enough for us to be documenting these patterns that are just getting worse. Let's look ahead to see what's on the horizon, because the cruel irony of the threat multiplier is also that these same communities that are experiencing all these vulnerabilities are also on the leading edge of displacement and gentrification. So as soon as their communities start to get amenities and infrastructure and green space and investments, like for example, some of the investments that came out of Sandy, green infrastructure investments, they all of a sudden become targeted by the real estate markets for gentrification and displacement. And now the most vulnerable people are just moving to even more vulnerable climate at-risk communities. And so the vicious cycle continues. And so in the fourth panel on climate change in the equity work group, we started to look more intentionally at climate displacement and climate gentrification, and how do communities get impacted both directly, like basement flooding, and indirectly by the pricing out by investments. And how do you do investments that anchor communities and help them stay and also become more resilient, and so that they don't have to leave their homes to be safe and to thrive. And which is a challenge. It is a complex problem. And interestingly, if you look at our equity work group chapter, we got a little bit of flack because we were like, let's take it pre-colonial. We literally went like before colonial times to today. And we were like, there's a reason why these communities are the way they are. They're vulnerable. If we look at the pattern of colonization, of how we built up New York City over time with redlining, with the whole history of New York City is about displacement and extraction. And so those things over hundreds of years have layered vulnerabilities on top of each other. And we literally map those vulnerabilities from pre-colonial times through colonial era, through the era of redlining, to show how land use practices have shaped the physical reality and vulnerabilities of communities today. And that's important to establish so that we can start to unpack what is it going to take for us to do, to respond to threat multipliers. You need benefit multipliers. So what are the benefit multipliers that we are going to do? Strategic targeted investments. And so in the Environmental Justice Advisory Board, they're talking about the moonshots. What are the moonshots that we need to, really, surgically apply to these areas that have faced disinvestment and now displacement for generations? So there's some good recommendations in there about how we get to benefit multipliers. And a lot of it has to do with land use and how we ensure safe, affordable housing for people so that they can remain in place and be safe.
Yeah, I want to talk more about that. And CCI has done a lot of work, not just on housing, but on a lot of issues that I think aren't traditionally thought of as being climate related necessarily. Can you spell out how policies that speak to working class New Yorkers' kitchen table concerns, whether it's rent or grocery costs or electricity bills, not only help the city to navigate and mitigate the climate crisis, but also just make living here more affordable and even, maybe more fun?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think it relates a lot, Anna, to what you're talking about. So at CCI and in my work, we often argue for an approach towards the transition away from fossil fuels, not as presenting itself as to working class communities in particular as a increased economic cost as it currently is, whether that's through spiking food costs that are disrupted by the climate crisis, utility bills like we're talking about, insurance rates for housing, but instead sort of seizes this opportunity to start thinking bigger and building new constituencies who are demanding climate action. So this is like a green economic populist approach that features critically like a very powerful and high capacity public sector. That's something we need to build and work on, working with some green firms, working with labor unions. That's a lot of my work, community groups, and thinking about what an expanded base or in labor's case membership looks like that experiences consistent and tangible improvements in their quality of life through climate action. And I think that when we're thinking about what that is for New York City, we have a great example right now through the platform on which Zohran Mamdani ran and won his mayoral primary. So starting with transit, which is obviously central, the fast and free bus demand would expand access, first of all, to affordable low carbon mobility for people across the city. It includes a number of measures that would allow buses to run faster and more efficiently. Eliminating fares means that New Yorkers can simply hop on the bus and get where they need to go, whether that's school or an appointment or their social life, without worrying about regressive fare costs that seem to keep increasing. It includes expanding open streets near public schools. So we're returning public space from cars to kids who deserve more space to play. And critically, it also has support from TWU, the transit union that makes the city move. And transit workers know best that affordable, accessible public transit is critical, not just for getting people where they need to go, but also it provides access to people for high road, high quality, blue collar union jobs that have solid pensions and benefits that they can count on. So these are quality of life improvements for New Yorkers, but it goes beyond that. Like thinking about the shift to a zero emissions transportation system needs to include this kind of increased access to public transit. But it also means that we can decarbonize more quickly. And we can also reduce the amount, the resource burden of the transition itself. So this looks like prioritizing putting large electric batteries into public transit buses that move hundreds or maybe thousands of people per day, rather than electric SUVs. Their batteries are about the same size and weight, but they'll only move maybe 1 or 2 people per day. So it's a quality of life improvement for us here in New York. We don't breathe the fumes, we don't have the noise pollution, we have increased quality of service, but it also delivers benefits to the global south, which is currently bearing most of the burden for the way our mining system works, and increasingly as more mining is onshored, indigenous communities here in the US. The other pieces, the core pieces of the agenda, as I'm sure everyone knows, are for universal childcare and addressing the housing crisis in a real way. And I think the cost and quality of childcare probably isn't the first thing we think of when we think of climate action. But it's true that it's a motivating thing for many people. As we saw, it's extremely popular. Childcare is extremely unaffordable in New York City. And it's forcing families with children who are young children out of the city. They're more than twice as likely to leave than their counterparts without kids. Even if they'd prefer to stay, they can't. So making childcare universal and free allows working class families to stay here, to stay in our high density, lower emission city, instead of forcing people to flee the city for more resource and energy intensive suburbs where you're much more likely to have a car, maybe even 2, definitely having more sprawl. So I think, that argument about keeping people in cities, making sure our social fabric is full is, it links back also to, as you're talking about the housing crisis. New York City is a majority tenant city, and landlords see their profits increasing, and New Yorkers can't afford the continuation of this status quo approach. We know people are being forced out of their homes, whether that's through eviction or cost of living. So yeah, I think in these ways, like when we start linking climate action that not only improves people's quality of life, we can also find ways to remove carbon pollution more efficiently, and maintain this critical social and economic stability for the majority of us who are working class in a time of increasingly unstable climate. So yeah.
Much. I wanted to turn back to you, Sandy, talk about what putting these sorts of proposals into practice can look like. You recently helped launch the Livable Futures Agenda, and in the past proposed legislation to put solar panels on municipal properties. So could you talk about these efforts and what New York City is able to do at the city level? And from your experience on the city council, what does it look like to build support for these sorts of measures and to take on the moneyed interests, say real estate lobbyists or electric utilities, to name
all the things.
name a few.
So I want to answer that, but I do want to just add on to what you mentioned about the water thing, because 2 things that, well, one thing that I don't know if New Yorkers realize, but we have a lot of New York police officers that actually serve up in the Catskills to protect our reservoir system. And actually in exchange for us having that water, we actually provide policing and police services and law enforcement services, I don't know what you call it, to a lot of towns outside the city. It's a huge amount of officers. It's something like over 1,500. So it's actually very costly to protect our water resource in a lot of different ways. So just throwing that little fun fact. And they actually opened up a whole new tunnel. I went and did a whole trip up there. Amazing thing. No, please.
Sorry, not the back, but the flip side of it is by doing the protected watershed, it's actually saving the city billions of dollars of capital investment. So the city decided that doing this cooperative model was in its interest rather than doing what it had to do for the Croton
Yeah,
Yes,
I
absolutely, right?
agree.
No,
I
no, no,
agree
no.
with it. I'm just
agreeing
like
with you. No,
fun
I'm agreeing
fact for
with you, right?
everybody.
Exactly. I mean, I think, and I'm just highlighting what an amazing opportunity when you work collaboratively together for something as basic as safe water. I'm sorry, I'm
Yeah,
agreeing.
no,
with you.
that's great. I also have a district where we used to have a big reservoir basin and Ridgewood Reservoir. Anyways, back to the question. Oh, and one other thing around water, because it is really important. People lose their houses over unpaid water bills. It's actually, they'll put a lien on your house. And we did pass legislation. So I'm kind of getting towards your question, but we did pass legislation last year to kind of improve the way the city collects on tax liens that both are property tax and water tax. It's not perfect. We're still trying to get rid of the whole thing, but we did make some off ramps for people. And actually we had DEP as part of that process to create financing plans and better just like customer service. I mean, they had a really terrible customer service thing so people could understand that they could lose their home if they don't pay their water bill. So you could lose your, generational household over that, which is really sad. So a couple of things I'll just lift up that we've done at the city council. I guess I've been really lucky to enter the city council with 34 other women, so 34 out of 51, which has made a world of difference, but there only was 11, and then we went to 34. So I don't know what it was like in the old times, but it's been pretty great. And so we've done some really cool things. We've put forth a couple different pieces of legislation around achieving universal childcare. My colleague and my actual district neighbor, Councilmember Jen Gutierrez, has a bill for like a truly universal childcare, inclusive of undocumented children and children of mixed statuses, which is super important for that universal piece. We passed universal curbside composting. That's Councilmember Hanif's bill that launched maybe this year, I forget. But then the mayor decided to cancel the enforcement of that program. So, it's a law on the books that everybody has to be doing this. But they have decided to not really carry out the making sure people actually do it. So hopefully after this election, and we have a new situation, I can say that we hopefully will get a mayor that's going to move that forward. We passed some big things like the meta frameworks, like zero waste by 30, which we're not going to achieve because we don't have an administration that prioritizes that. We're finally getting our commercial waste zone system coming online, slowly chugging along. That's meant to force all commercial businesses to separate their trash, and it's going to cut down vehicle miles and a bunch of other good stuff. So we're doing some stuff in terms of just clean lanes of environmental work. We passed a law last year, or maybe it was this year, I can't remember now, to mandate the city's own goal of achieving 150 megawatts of publicly owned renewable energy by 2035, 150 megawatts. They have to achieve 100 megawatts of it by 2030. And that was just an amazing experience of forcing the administration and the city that has already stated it wants to do this and was really dragging its feet to actually force them to do it. It's on the books. And actually there is money, capital money put in the out years closer to 2028, 2029, which is very, very close to when we're actually supposed to be achieving this. But it's there, the money's there, at least for now. We have to fight to always keep it there. But the one thing I loved about this piece of legislation was that we were able to, through it, get the electricians union to ink a deal. So all of that work will be green union jobs, and over 700 public buildings, parking lots, schools primarily, anything that's publicly owned is up for grabs to install solar arrays, which is really exciting. And the schools have done most of the work on the solar. I mean, 80% of our public solar program is being done through the schools. Right now, the city has completed about 24, and if you know more, or if I have bad numbers, correct me. But as far as I know, it's 24 megawatts currently, installed and about 51 additional megawatts of projects in the works. So we're moving really, really slow. The other thing that we're trying to do that I was, two things and then I'll be quiet. One, we were actually slated to pass a bill this week, and it got pulled because of safety concerns, but publicly owned clean energy storage, the battery energy storage systems, which is kind of like the complement to holding all of that clean energy that we produce and then making it available in peak hours of demand so that we can avoid blackouts and brownouts. But there's a lot of misinformation being put around and some really fringy tinfoil hat theories about these systems, although they are they require rigorous certification and safety standards. And then we're also trying this like cool pavement thing where we put this like topical treatment on the roads and it reflects the heat off or the sun. And so that's something we've negotiated with and we're looking forward to it. But, you know, a lot of the stuff that is hopefully going to happen under a different administration is going to require obviously big state cooperation. But we're really, really excited about it. And I know that on the council's end, we can pass a lot of stuff. We passed Local Law 97, but there are real challenges to getting it done when it comes down to like dollars. And it really matters who is the executive of the city and what their priorities are, because what we've seen under the last 3 years is that even though we have all these mandates on the books, there's really no accountability if you just don't achieve it, unless we are all like really on their ass all the time. And that takes an incredible amount of energy and organized people.
Well, to close out and keep us on the note of things that are good, I wanted to ask the rest of the panel to talk about sort of ways that New York City can protect ourselves moving forward. And as the federal government continues to take a sledgehammer to environmental regulations and funding, what can cities do to keep themselves both safe and functional, but also resilient against the mounting effects of climate change? Are there any best practices you've seen in your research, either in New York or elsewhere, that might be instructive as we look toward the next several years, both in the sort of scary sense of the federal administration, but also in the positive sense of maybe having an administration here in the city that's a little bit more willing to do the sorts of work that we need? So maybe start down with you, and then we can go down.
So I think I think one way to think about this is, states do have rights, and they can actually have environmental regulations that are more stringent than the federal. The minimum is the federal standards, but the states can do better than that. And so in many ways, states were doing that in the previous Trump administration, where they continued some of their climate work. And I guess the question is, they should need to continue doing some of that work. To think about, and again, not to keep talking about drinking water, but an example that comes up that's important, I think, for us to pay attention to, for the reasons you're saying about how this administration is cutting down regulations which had been approved in the previous administration. I don't know how familiar people are with this class of compounds called PFAS, perfluorinated alkyl substances. So this is a growing threat to drinking water across the nation. And without going into too much details of how and why, before the federal government decided to regulate the presence of PFAS in drinking water, states were already doing this, because a lot of states were actually struggling with it in their drinking water. The communities were being impacted, particularly communities where these chemicals are being made and released into the water. So they had imposed already state-level regulations, and so that's something which I think needs to continue happening. So that's one example. I think the kind of work that NPCC does is critical, and I think the city, I mean, I can speak to that, but I think we're the only city across the nation which has a city-level panel on climate change. The best, but from what I've heard, it is the only one that, so that's something also I think to think about. How do we then use that information to help inform city agencies to drive the kinds of policies to make the cities more climate resilient?
thank you for the plug for the NPCC. We had a lot of recommendations in the NPCC report. If you look back at all the reports NPCC's done, not a lot of those actually get implemented, unfortunately. But there's some great research in there. We put forward in the equity chapter best case studies for how you prevent climate displacement and climate gentrification. It takes many tools in the toolbox. There's not one silver bullet or law or policy that's going to fix, generations of this issue. So we looked at things like, Push Buffalo did this like block by block, 10 block by 10 block blue and green zones where they trained residents in weatherization, solar, microgrids, battery storage, things that got people jobs, got them in unions, but also got homes ready, climate ready. We looked at places like Philadelphia. They created an environmental justice community collaborative fund. Every year they put out a certain amount of money only for community-based groups, civic block groups that are doing resiliency and emergency preparedness work in their communities to implement, basically it's your money, you do what you want with it, sort of participatory budgeting, but for EJ and climate. We looked at right here in New York City, there's a lot of great work being done in communities led by frontline community groups who are on the cutting edge, where other people are looking at us as the model. Things like green reindustrialization of our waterfronts, like what's happening with Grid and Brooklyn and Sunset Park, microgrids. WEACT put in solar on NYCHA buildings, creating microgrids with NYCHA buildings. Also, community land trust. There's a lot of work happening on community land and community land back. How do you get cooperative housing, affordable housing into the hands of communities and sustain it, and also still build some wealth and some anchoring in the communities? We looked at Edgemere, was one of the case studies we looked at in NPCC 4, and there were good and bad things, lessons to be learned there from the residents themselves who told us about their struggles even with community land trust, of being able to hold on in those communities. But there are others, we have groups like, we work with a group through our fellowship program in Lahaina, and after the fires in Hawaii, they had a whole resurgence of community organizing around getting land back out of the prospectors' hands, out of the climate disaster capitalists, and into the hands of Native Hawaiians and Filipino workers, so that they could build the kinds of resiliency and housing that would sustain them when the next fire comes, so that they're not displaced by Airbnbs and prospectors. So those are models that I think we can all learn from, and we have a lot of community groups leading the way right here in New York City, and we need to be funding that and listening to that. And that's one of the biggest lessons from NPCC, is like sometimes the best models are in your backyard. You just have to find creative ways to finance them and fund them.
Yeah, this is such a big question, and I love all these answers so much. Obviously, in New York State, we're sort of staring down the Trump bill that's around the corner with cuts to SNAP and Medicaid. We should also be clear about the fact that it's possible federal grants could be further cut. That's 7% of New York's budget. And there are other ways that the federal government could be moving against us. But I think as a first step in this kind of horror chaos, we should also be moving towards an understanding that New York's economy is the 8th largest in the world and is more than big enough to protect our people from Trump's cuts and provide affordability and social services that are the bedrock of society and keep us on track for our climate goals. So as a first step, I think we should think about fixing the tax system so that we can function as a state without having to rely on a fascist federal government. I think in 2025, this is a lot of what standing up to Trump really needs to look like. And then on energy specifically here in New York State, as we've been talking about, energy costs are huge. Almost a third of New Yorkers are energy insecure, as people have mentioned earlier. And Trump is doing things like cutting LIHEAP and other affordability programs at the same time that Con Ed is proposing steep rate increases. So it's like a double whammy for people from the federal administration and from corporate utilities. So I think that when this is the situation, again, the public sector does have a responsibility to intervene. And we can do it in a way that keeps us on track with our state climate mandate, which is 70% renewable energies by 2030. And we have many tools, like Councilmember Nurse laid out all of these incredible programs for municipal solar. Battery storage is so important. Another major tool that the state has is the New York Power Authority, which under the Build Public Renewables Act is mandated to build 15 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. And they recently, in their latest strategic plan, doubled the projects that they had on the books to 7 gigawatts from what they had previously, which is like fantastic. It's great, but it's also not enough. The climate crisis is in our daily lives. And I think it's also time for us to think about redoubling our efforts on building public renewables that will do sort of the multi-pronged thing that we need to happen, which is slash pollution, slash carbon emissions, make energy more affordable for people, and protect our planet. And I think we can acknowledge that even as federal tax credits that were so helpful, like the Inflation Reduction Act, are being clawed back, there are other mechanisms that we can be turning to at the state level, like expanded bond financing, for example, to ensure that we continue to meet these goals. And then just like on a broader point, I do think that we can and should draw inspiration from organizers across the country who continue to win on climate, even in very difficult political terrain. So earlier today, I was on a panel and with some organizers who are fighting for green public schools in Columbus, Ohio. And they're fighting in a context where their government is sort of actively colluding and partnering with the mega agenda to shift to privatization of public schools, or in their case, it's voucherization. And they're still finding ways to get the cost savings of shifting to renewable energy. They're making their schools more resilient, more efficient, and they're providing students in the teaching workforce with safe classrooms through the climate crisis. And they're able to do this with the tools that they have, which are very clear power analysis. They have relationships, they're building them with the district, with financing authorities, finding green funds where they can. And they're doing it in such a way that allows them to continue to build power, even right now, not only to defend against attacks, but to move beyond the defensive and into the offensive in our shared fight for a green future that works for working people. So lots of lessons to learn there.
I can't think of a better note to end on. So thank you all so much for giving.